Right, now in this first chapter, strategic management, we're going to see what the phrase strategic management actually means. And this is quite interesting because, as you'll see, there turns out to be 8 different ways of interpreting strategic management. So if you said you wanted me to manage your strategic side of the business, what do I need to do? There's 8 different interpretations that can be put on that. And actually in the real world, there's more than that. But for this paper, the examiner has stipulated 8 different things that he wants you to understand. The first of those is what's referred to as the rational strategy. And rational strategy is a very formalized strategy. It follows a very rational, logical, step-by-step approach, and it lays out exactly what we're going to do for fairly long periods of time. And you see from this little diagram, I've suggested that we've got what's actually happening in the environment, and that's my wiggly line running through here, and then I'm comparing that to what the strategy is actually giving us, the rational planning strategy, which are these chunks of straight line. So you can see that a potential issue with the rational strategy is it won't necessarily always keep us in line with the environment. There are times where we're very closely in line. A couple of times there, we're quite closely in line, there, we're quite closely in line. So, at times we're absolutely spot on, but at other times, you can see there are some quite big gaps between the strategy and what's actually happening on the ground or out there in the real world. So that could be problematic. Now, that will largely depend, though, on how volatile your environment is, and I've deliberately made my environmental line here very volatile, very fluid, going all over the place, and that won't necessarily always be the case. But the rational strategy is very useful to us because it gives us a set of tools that we can use, and we won't necessarily use them all in all situations, but if you've got a bag of tools, it does make it much easier to tackle different jobs. So some of the tools covered in the rational strategy we might be able to use in some of the other interpretations of the word strategy as well. And so for that reason, we will come back to this rational strategy idea in chapter 2 and look at the tools that are involved in coming up with these long-term plans. Right, the second type of strategy that you need to be familiar with is what's referred to as adaptive strategy. That's Mintzberg's phraseology for it. It's also known as incrementalism, and that was Charles Lindblom. He called it incrementalism. So different words, but they're still talking about the same thing. And they suggest that, as we just have, that the rational planning approach won't necessarily work if you've got a lot of environmental uncertainty and complexity and dynamism, so it's all changing very rapidly. And so what they suggest is, over the page, undertaking a number of much smaller steps. And hopefully, as you can see in this diagram here, if I take a number of small steps, I stay far closer in line with what's actually happening with the environment. There are still places where I miss out a little bit, but broadly speaking, you can see a much closer fit with the environment. So an adaptive approach, adapting to what's happening in the environment, fitting with what's going on in the environment. Right, the third approach is described as emergent strategy. Now, even if you go for the more formalized rational strategy that we mentioned on the previous page, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's all you'll end up doing. If you're into gardening in any way, and if you've ever planted a little soil with some different plants, some of those plants you plant may grow and may look very nice and absolutely fine. Some of the plants may not grow, but some plants may grow unexpectedly, may emerge. Now, some of those emergent plants may be weeds and need pulling up and throwing away, but some of them may be very nice plants. You might want to keep them. So sometimes what a company ends up doing is not what was perhaps originally intended. And I've put, not that you need to learn this, but I've put in the notes here a real life example of this, and this is quite a well-known example, so you may well have seen this before, but it's to do with Honda back in the 1950s. And in the 1950s, Honda was pretty much unheard of outside of Japan. And all they produced at that time were motorcycles. So Honda was a motorcycle producer in Japan. And somebody at Honda had the idea of breaking into the American motorcycle market. It was a very big market. They thought, well, that would be a good idea for us. Let's get into that market. And so they took some of their huge Honda bikes across to America to see if they could sell them. And they ran into difficulty because the testosterone-filled young Americans were a bit suspicious of the Honda bikes because they'd never heard the name Honda. I know now it's a universally known name, but at this time they hadn't heard of that, so they're a bit suspicious about it. And also, when they did ride the Honda bikes, because the American geography is very, very different from Japan. Japan is a relatively small, very mountainous island, so the roads are very bendy and steep and so on, and you need a bike that clings to the road well, doesn't skid off down the side of a mountain. In America, they largely speaking have very flat, huge, straight roads, and so speed is what people were looking for. And the trouble was, if you took the Honda bikes to any sort of speed, they leaked oil all over the place. They weren't that reliable when driven at speed. Anyway, to help the Honda sales reps get around in the American cities that they were trying to sell these bikes in, because these cities are physically quite spread out, they sent across some of the Honda 50cc Super Cub, as they were called, bikes, which basically were mopeds. So they sent some of these mopeds over so that the sales reps could get around Los Angeles and places like this. And one of the Sears, the buyers for Sears, saw one of the Honda reps sitting on one of these Super Cubs and asked if he could buy some. And the reps said, well, no, we're not here to sell Super Cubs. We're here to sell these big Honda bikes. And they said, well, no, we're not interested in those, but we do like the idea of a motorized bicycle, which is in effect what these mopeds were. So anyway, to cut a long story short, some of these Super Cubs were sent across for Sears, and they sold out almost immediately. And in the end, what happened is that Honda broke into the American market by establishing itself as a moped seller, first and foremost, and got a very good reputation for selling mopeds, and then later was able to successfully launch its motorbikes. Now, that was never the original strategy. That wasn't the original plan. That was a plan that emerged over time. So it wasn't what they set out to do. And if we go over the page, a little diagram that Mintzberg has produced again, just showing us how you've got your planned strategies at the top here, some of which will end up failing, sadly, but some of which you will carry out and will be realised. But you've also got down the bottom the emergent strategies. And they come from simply what we're doing, what's described as the patterns of behaviour. So because of the way we're behaving, because of what we're doing, because of the sort of business we are, these emergent strategies just come about. And so the realised strategies will be a mix of the deliberate strategies, the planned strategies, and the emergent strategies. And Mintzberg describes it as being a skill known as crafting. You've got to bring together both the planned and the unplanned, if you like, and decide how best to fit the unplanned, the emergent, with the planned, with the deliberate. So we have emergent strategies. Now, that one shows you quite nicely that you're not necessarily having to choose one of these 8 different strategic approaches. In the real world, you may pick a mix from these different approaches that I'm describing to you. And so one organisation might use, say, the rational strategy to start with, and then might use one of the other approaches I'm going to go through with you, maybe the adaptive strategy a little bit later on, or whatever. You can put them all together. Right. The fourth one is what's described as evolutionary strategy. And this comes from the biological term evolution. And evolution is where things change gradually over time in a response to what's happening in the outside world. And this is very much the case here. Evolutionary strategy, it describes a gradual change, but I say in response to what's happening outside, so in response to external factors. But the change is quite slow, and so that does give a problem if the outside world is changing quickly. If the outside world is changing quickly, then the evolutionary approach isn't going to work. And we've seen with global warming, which is now changing the climatic conditions relatively quickly, that different species are struggling because they can't change quickly enough. Right, section 5 is the systems-based approach, a systems-based strategy. Now, you may well have come across this in your E1 studies. So to start with, all we're saying is that any organisation can be thought of as a system, and the system it has is set up in order to achieve goals. So you start off with a goal, and then what you do is you take certain inputs, and those inputs will come into the organisation, but from the outside world. So you can see that input box is partly within the boundary, within the organisation, and partly outside it. Then we process those inputs, so we've bought some raw materials, so we manufacture something with those raw materials, and then we produce our outputs, and they're produced internally but sold externally. So again, the output box is partly inside the boundary and partly outside the boundary. You've also got then the boundary, which I say shows where the organisation starts and stops, and outside of that you've got the environment, what's going on in the outside world. So any organisation, it is argued, can be thought of as a system, as described. And then, if we just go over the page, what strategy is all about, if that's what you think, is strategy is all about making sure that we achieve whatever our system's objectives are. So strategy is all about identifying your objectives and then achieving those objectives. Right. The sixth approach is something that's called transaction cost theory. Now, you may never have asked yourself this, but if you think back 200 or 300 years ago, we didn't have large businesses. Most people looked after themselves, and that had been the case for thousands and thousands of years. And then suddenly we had the Industrial Revolution and all the rest, and we had these businesses, and nowadays very, very big businesses, doing things for us. And why? Why is that the case? And transaction cost theory explains to us why we get businesses doing what they do. And it's basically because they can do it far, far more cheaply. It's far more economically. So it actually makes economic sense. And I was listening to the radio a little while ago, and there was a chap on there who'd grown his own strawberries. I think he was probably an accountant because he'd worked out how much it had cost him for each strawberry. And I can't remember exactly what it was now, but it was something like £2.57 per strawberry, which is, of course, far, far more than he would have had to pay, even if he was at Wimbledon, if he'd bought some strawberries that had been grown by somebody else, somebody who specialised in growing strawberries. So how does this apply to us from a strategic point of view? Well, once you understand what transaction cost theory is saying, it's looking at the costs of carrying out different transactions and is then trying to make sure we do that as efficiently as possible. Once you understand that, what the strategy then is all about making sure we carry out the right transactions and we get other people to carry out the other transactions for us. Nowadays, it's very popular to describe this as outsourcing. But this is something companies have always done. They do some things themselves and they get other people to do some things for them. And if we have a look, I've got a little example here to do with a builder. And if you're a builder, you might be a relatively small one-man band type builder. but occasionally you might get a slightly larger job, and so you might get some other builders to come and help you on that particular job, or you may have a job that needs a particular skill that you don't have, and so you get some other builders to help you in that regard. So in effect, you are, as that builder, you are outsourcing some of the work when you need to do that. Whereas if you were a large builder such as Barratt Homes, who are building houses virtually all the time and lots of them, then you probably have bricklayers who you employ in-house. And so we can't say that in all situations the same thing will happen. Which activities, which transactions are carried out by a company may well depend on its size, but may also depend on its position or which country it's in or whatever. There's all sorts of factors. And transaction cost theory is simply saying it doesn't mind how we do it, doesn't matter who does it, as long as it is the most efficient way of carrying out those transactions. So transaction cost theory, I say, works out what we do and what we get somebody else to do for us. We've then got the resource-based strategy. Now, resource-based strategy says the starting point for strategy is to look at your resources. So what resources do we have internally, and hence what can we do with those resources? And to help us here, Hofer and Schendel give us quite a broad list as to what resources might mean, what the word resources might cover, some of which are the tangible resources, but some of them are intangible resources. And the resource-based strategy view would include all resources. They don't just have to be buildings and people and that sort of stuff. You can have intangible resources as well. Reputation, brand name, that sort of thing. Now, I've made a small point down the bottom, which is if there are any unique resources, so if you have anything that your competitors, any resources that your competitors don't have, then that gives you a really, really good opportunity to do something that puts you in a better position than your competitors. And so this is described as a strategic asset. It's an asset that you can use to get a competitive advantage. And we'll come back to this idea of competitive advantage later. But a competitive advantage is where you have some edge, some advantage over your competitors. So that's obviously jolly good news. And these unique resources, these strategic assets, will do exactly that for us. So if I was looking at the resource-based view, I would start by seeing whether we have any unique resources. The only snag with this view is you might well have some unique resources, you might well have lots of resources internally, but unless the outside world is looking for something that those internal resources can produce, this wouldn't necessarily give you a successful strategy. So again, we just need to be careful. Over the page, we've got the ecological model, and the ecological model says that you need to make sure you respond and take account of what's happening externally. And we had previously in section 4 the evolutionary strategy, and these two are similar, but the evolutionary strategy took change over a long period of time. It was a gradual change. The ecological model is saying, no, we need to respond far quicker, so we need to come up with short-term plans. Now that's slightly different from the adaptive strategy that we saw, section 2. The adaptive strategy was more a trial and error approach. So as the environment changes, we make different changes, and as we said at the time, hopefully those keep us in line with the environment. But they won't always do so, but if they don't, you take a step back and take another step forward in a different direction and see if that works. So the ecological model is still a planning model. You're still planning what you're going to do, but you plan in much smaller, shorter chunks. The rational strategy, section 1, that we looked at the start of the chapter, was looking at planning in larger chunks, longer periods of time. So we've got 8 different ways of thinking about strategy, of viewing strategy, of applying strategy. And then section 9 is slightly different. Section 9 there says, now, at what level does strategy apply? And in fact, it can apply at any level. And there are 3 distinct levels that we talk about and that you need to be aware of for this paper. The first is what's known as corporate strategy, corporate level strategy. And this is strategy that is undertaken at the top of the organisation. So corporate could stand for company, so it's going to affect the whole company. And so this is very much the big picture stuff. And so here the focus tends to be on the longer term and hence on the external factors. So if you are in charge of corporate strategy, you'd probably take a long-term approach, and I say you'd want to keep an eye on what's happening in the outside world. So that is likely to pull you in the direction of the rational strategy, because we said that takes a long-term view, and keeping an eye on what's happening in the environment. And we'll see that the rational model that we're going to have a look at in chapter 2, which develops the rational approach to strategy, does exactly that. But we also said we've got things like the evolutionary strategy, which responds to what's happening in the outside world, though not very quickly, and the ecological model that also responds to the outside world, but tends to take a short-term approach. So corporate level strategy, high level strategy, strategy that affects the whole organisation, where we decide what we're going to do as a business and where we're going to do it, and those sort of big questions. Underneath that, you've then got business level strategy, and business level strategy is the strategy that applies to individual business areas, or what we describe as strategic business units, SBUs, a strategic business unit. You may well not have come across that phrase before. You may have used the phrase division, which is absolutely fine. So a different division, each division carries out a different type of business. And if you're making plans at that level, that will be a business level strategy. Now here, the time frame tends to shorten a little bit, so we're looking here at the medium term, and we tend to be looking at a mix of what's going on externally and internally. And then the last level, the bottom level, is operational, or some people describe it as functional strategies, and this is where we're looking at what's happening on a day-to-day basis in our different departments. And so if this is the level you're looking at, what becomes important to you is the short term and the internal. Now, in this paper, the questions the examiner is likely to ask you are more likely to be aimed at the business or corporate levels. You need to know what the operational level is. I mean, you may get a question asking you to give examples of the 3 different levels. But if the question is looking at the application of strategy, it is more likely that it will be the application of strategy, I say, either to the corporate level or at the business level. And the reason for that is because those are the levels that you probably haven't got much personal experience of yet. And what the examiner wants to make sure is that you know what strategy is at those levels before you meet it in the real world. So that sets the scene for us on the different ways of looking at strategy, and where we can pause now because we finished this chapter and then move on and have a look at chapter number 2, which will take us through the rational strategy approach.